So I don't know if this has already been done yet in this conference, but I'm going to do it anyway. As I was researching Albuquerque, this is my first time in New Mexico, and its many natural and human-made amenities. I learned, of course, that UNM has an ancestral land acknowledgement statement. So although I do sometimes have ambivalence about such sort of codified statements, I do want to acknowledge that it was a product of a collaborative effort. And so I'm just going to briefly read it. The University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the original peoples of New Mexico, including the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache tribes, have since time immemorial deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. Therefore, I acknowledge the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land now and throughout the generations. I'm a little nervous. I'm truly honored to be here today. I want to acknowledge a little bit about where I'm from and what brought me here. I remember when I first presented my first paper on Chicana speculative fiction. It was in 2009 at the American Comparative Literature Association's annual conference. I felt like a fish out of water. It was at Harvard University. It was a place very foreign to me. The panel that I was participating in was called Revisiting Greater Mexico, and my little paper, written over about a 3-month period, was called Virtual Aslan, Rethinking Greater Mexico and Borderland Speculative Fiction. Although I don't admittedly remember exactly all the details of that paper, I do remember an exchange I had with one of the senior scholars in attendance who had also delivered a paper at that panel. After the presentation, he took me aside and smiled kindly, and I think he could tell I was nervous. And he said to me in very sweet words and very plainly, keep doing this. We need more papers on Chicanic science fiction. More people need to know that we write science fiction. That brief exchange, along with the trip I took the next year to Tijuana, gave me the encouragement and inspiration I needed to keep working on this, and has in no small part played a large role in getting me here today, actually. Looking at the many paper titles and panel descriptions for this amazing conference, it's clear to me that he was not alone in finding the value and potential of Latinx science fiction. It is clear to me that I'm in very good, impressive company. How energizing and inspiring phrases are like Afro-Latinidad time travel, speculative testimonial, and Latinx space oddities in Trump's USA, the liberatory promise of Taino futurisms, and of course, papers that promise to explore speculative Latinx identities and anti-racist futures in the culturally iconic franchise that is Star Trek. To this end, I wish to join others in thanking the conference organizers, Professors Catherine Merla Watson, Matthew Goodwin, and Santiago Vaquera Vasquez. You have all curated an amazing lineup of speakers, performers, artists, of which I am only one small part. I also want to just briefly acknowledge nomenclature. Throughout my speech today, I will use terms like Chicano and Chicana or Chicanx, all of which refer, of course, to people who self-identify as individuals of Mexican descent who live in the US. I recognize, though, that to be a Chicana is to be a Latina, but to be a Latina is not necessarily to be Chicana. It is important, I think, to resist universalizing Latinx identities and experiences, or all identities and experiences for that matter. One's experience as a Cuban American in South Florida can vastly differ from a Tejana in rural South Texas, a Nueva Hispana in New Mexico, and of course a Chicana like myself from urban Los Angeles. I will do my best to differentiate this nomenclature as I proceed. As I'm sure all of you know, Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa once wrote that nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. What an amazing, simple sentence with such far-reaching implications, especially, I think, for people of color in the age of late capitalism. It echoes something Walida y Marisha wrote nearly 30 years later. Whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. Educator, activist, and science fiction writer, Imerisha has spent years traveling around the United States empowering students by validating and energizing their imaginations. Along with her co-conspirator, Adrienne Marie Brown, she leads workshops on zine making, world building, and the community building for students interested in learning how to organize for change, which is a skill one has to learn. There is something profoundly possible when the imagination meets marginalization, when writers of color in this age of climate disaster, economic instability, political volatility, dare to imagine alternatives and elsewheres that disrupt and ultimately transform the realities besieging them in their communities. All of the fascinating papers, performances, and presentations at this conference partake in this project by bringing to light Latinx writers, artists, and cultural visionaries whose work harnesses the power of the imaginary to both resist and reflect, but also shape new realities. Although their collective and cultural histories may be marred, scarred by trauma, struggle, bewilderment, confusion, through their work, they project narratives of resilience, survival, even triumph. Latinx Visions, this conference, is testament, therefore, to the lasting impact and cultural value of this work that refuses to foreclose on the possibility for change by exploring imaginary oppositional spaces that can and must inspire future generations of students, writers, and visionaries. Because I believe that people in place shape who we are and the stories we tell, I want briefly to acknowledge the people in place that have brought me here today. Like many in this room, my reality was made possible because of the many and difficult sacrifices and efforts of those who came before me, including those who make up my bloodlines and those whose storylines included fights for the freedom and opportunities that I have been able to enjoy. But I want to speak briefly to those peoples and places for another reason. For many writers of color who dabble in speculative fiction, the line between science fiction and social reality is an optical illusion. Chicano sci-fi novelist Ernest Hogan makes his point in his Chicano Nautica manifesto when he claims that being Chicano is a science fiction state of mind. African-American novelist Ishmael Reed makes this point when he claims that being Black in the United States is quite literally a far-out experience, similar to the stuff of science fiction. In other words, to inhabit a Black or brown body and to navigate the world as such is in and of itself science fiction. My mother, for example, migrated to the United States from Indonesia when she was very young. She knew only a few English words when she arrived. Her family settled in Inglewood, California, a neighborhood southwest of downtown Los Angeles. At that time, Inglewood was still predominantly white, but its racial demographics rapidly were changing, prompting white racial anxieties and eventually a great white exodus. Her early years in the States were defined by the challenges that are more or less unique, or at least can be, to first-generation immigrants of color. She was the target of overt and covert acts of racism, and her family faced perpetual economic vulnerability. When I was a child, I would hear her describe what it was like going to the public school system in LA as an English language learner in the 1960s. And I would listen to her describe the visceral shame she experienced in those spaces. Now, when I think back on those stories, I'm reminded of Ruben Ortiz Torres's 1998 art piece, ESL, which uncannily captures the science fictionality of her otherness. My father, from whom I get my surname, was born in East LA to working class Mexican Americans. Back then, they didn't call themselves Chicanos. His mother cleaned houses and his father did yard work for wealthier, whiter Angelinos who lived in neighborhoods that seemed to him like distant planets, despite being only 20 minutes away. He was born before the freeways arrived, the same freeways that Chicana novelist Elena Maria Viramontes describes as menacing earth movers that displaced entire neighborhoods and amputated the streets of LA into stumped dead ends. The same freeways depicted in decidedly sci-fi imagery on the Great Wall of Los Angeles. I think I'm gonna just click this. There we go. Like my mother, my father grew up speaking two languages and experiencing decided racial oppression. As a teenager, he worked as a gardener himself. and he would talk about envying what he called the suits for whom he worked. This was the nickname he and his four brothers gave to the wealthy white Angelenos who drove cars, new cars, and lived in big houses. Eventually, through a combination of work and luck, and I here would like to emphasize luck, my parents eked out a lower middle class existence. And although they never enjoyed the benefits of higher education, this is probably because they lived in the before times, which is before neoliberal capitalism had the sort of death grip that it does now. They managed to climb the social ladder in a way that provided the benefits that I enjoy. I was born into this reality, and although I never experienced some of the hardships they did, I still navigated daily life as a brown person in a white world. Because my parents moved to what we might call a predominantly white neighborhood as they climbed this social ladder, I grew up surrounded by people who did not look like me. Racial epithets were par for the course in Southern California, from my days in early grade school to my teenage years and beyond. In these strange new spaces, I was too brown to be white, but yet too white to be brown. I lived in a limbo land of sorts, a non-place that was simultaneously multiple places at once. In this way, I should have been right at home in the dazzlingly diverse sprawl that is Southern California. After all, was this not one of the most racially, lingually, and culturally diverse spaces in the world? Was this not the same SoCal that Chicano sci-fi novelist Alejandro Morales once described as a multidimensional zone of radical cultural juxtaposition, a prototype for an urban world future that awaited the 21st century? Looking back now, I understand that while LA was undergoing rapid demographic shifts, the Anglo-cultural dominant was simply not ready for the emerging 21st century multiculture. Witness, for example, the onslaught of commercially popular sci-fi films from this time, films such as Blade Runner, Escape from LA, and Strange Days. While perhaps entertaining to be sure, they wrote ethnic excess into urban decay. With their perpetually rainy and gloomy streets swarming with brown bodies, the future cities staring back at me on the screen presented as being plagued by concentrated ethnic ghettos, foreign tongues, and what can best be described as so-called third world settler camps. In all of them, the lone white, typically male protagonist desperately tries to flee from these ethnic cesspools, with Rick Deckard in Blade Runner fleeing to the countryside, and Snake Plissken longing, as the title of his film makes clear, to escape from LA. These futures extrapolate from the present, as evidenced by the strangely written LA city planning document that was itself speculative. Titled LA 2000, A City for the Future, the document, which was written by business leaders and LA's investor class, warned of a dystopian Blade Runner scenario where the eventual fusion of multi-ethnic cultures and languages would result in an ominous, hostile social landscape that could best be described as dystopian. By contrast, Latinx speculative visionaries insist that radically multicultural spaces, what some in this conference might refer to as heterotopias, are spaces of potential and possibility, not necessarily fear and hostility. They can be life-affirming, generative, and maybe even, dare I say, hopeful. They can be utopias, not dystopias. Witness, for example, the eco-utopian hemispheric space of La Chinganaza and Beatriz Pita and Rosada Sanchez's post-apocalyptic novela Lunar Braceros, which, by the way, they just released the sequel to it, which is, I think, really, really fascinating. Emerging in the aftermath of mass economic collapse and environmental destruction brought about by what other than hypercapitalism, Chinganaza is described as, quote, an alternative space and a little oasis that is home to a growing underclass made up of predominantly Latinx and indigenous laborers of the future, whose roots can be traced back to what was previously known in the novel as North and Central America. Although this imaginary community is fragile, tenuous, and perpetually at risk of invasion, it offers readers a brief template for survival and resilience. It reminds me of what Cordelia Barrera calls the, quote, fantastic heterotopic spaces that point to the possible, to the tomorrow. These are spaces that might begin in dystopia or after the apocalypse, but ultimately strive towards a utopia. In Barrera's own words, they are spaces that engage in, quote, blending social dreaming with transcendent idealism. Just as space figures prominently in the work I've touched upon so far, and in my own life as a Chicano from LA, so too has it been formative in the emergence of scholarship on Latinx speculative art and literature. In fact, place is central to this very event. New Mexico, after all, was the site that inspired Catherine Ramirez's concept of Chicano futurism, a concept she introduced to the world in her 2004 essay on the cyberarte of Marion C. Martinez, a self-described Indio-Hispanic who was born in northern New Mexico and grew up in the shadow of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. In this groundbreaking piece, which continues to influence both Latinx studies, but also science fiction studies, Ramirez begins by reminding her readers that New Mexico has, like so many US Western states, functioned as, quote, a type of contact zone for the empires, nations, and peoples who have claimed, settled, and traversed it for the past 400 years. She goes on to detail the ways in which, as a cultural practice, Chicano futurism represents and also interrogates the problems and promises of technology as they manifest in the material and lived experiences of Chicanx communities living in this contact zone. She goes on to explain why and how Martinez's work is so emblematic of Chicano futurism. Using discarded computer parts, some of which Martinez took from a dump at Los Alamos, Martinez transforms traditional Hispano symbols using these technologies. Her cyberarte troubles the line between the old and the new, the mystical and the technological. And it also simultaneously underscores New Mexico's history as functioning as a landfill of sorts for the debris and detritus of 20th century technoculture. Chicano futurism emerges at this intersection, where deep histories of settler colonialism in the American Southwest converge with the technological power tools of empire. In practice, Chicano futurism also challenges assumptions about race and technology, assumptions that all too often freeze people of color, and certainly indigeneity in time, excluding them from, quote, the world of science, technology, and reason, and confining them to the domain of superstition, mythology, and intuition. It thus follows, of course, that for many of us, simply imagining ourselves in the future is in and of itself a radical act, or at least it can be. Once again, I am reminded of the multimedia artwork of Ruben Ortiz Torres, who, like Martinez, recycles and refashions found objects and disrupts assumptions about brown bodies, technology, and futurity. In Viva la Raza Cósmica, for example, Ortiz Torres refashions popular commercial action figures into powerful Aztec-like warriors and positions them in front of street graffiti that reads Viva la Raza, long live the race, mestizo race. Titled Viva la Cósmica Razma, Ortiz Torres' piece engages in doublespeak as it transforms the commercially popular transformer figures and resignifies the popular Chicano power saying to propel the Chicano movement into the future. Revolution, transformation, perpetuation. These are the things of Chicanx and Latinx visions. And I want to pause and briefly just acknowledge that the cosmic race as conceived by Jose Vasconcelos in the early 20th century does have its political problems, but I would go into that in other contexts, not this speech. In her introduction to Alter Mundos, an anthology of Latinx speculative literature, film, and pop culture, Ramirez revisits her groundbreaking term, Chicano futurism. She acknowledges, many years later, that it is really one of many alternative futurisms, a term she borrows from other sci-fi visionaries and scholars. These alternative futurisms acknowledge, quote, the need for peoples across time and space to scrutinize the present, re-examine the past, and envision the future, hence the title of my speech. When I first read what Ramirez wrote, I immediately thought of Emma Perez's concept of the decolonial imaginary, which she introduces way back in 1999. To understand what the decolonial imaginary entails, it might first be helpful to understand how Perez understands the post-colonial. From the start, Perez troubled the term post-colonial. In her words, the post-colonial is more of a utopian project and not real-life socio-political conditions that already exist. The decolonial, by contrast, is located somewhere in between the colonial and the post-colonial. To cite her own words, the decolonial imaginary is perpetually caught in the time lag between the colonial and the post-colonial. Existing as it does somewhere between the deep colonial past and the utopian post-colonial future, it encompasses what she calls the interstitial gaps. These interstitial gaps exist between two temporalities or times, the colonial past and the post-colonial future. The decolonial encompasses the as of yet unheard, the as of yet unthought, and the as of yet unspoken. Therefore, to work towards the decolonial imaginary is to reinscribe the old with the new. But, and this is important, the new is always by default imaginary. It is a space of becoming, of potential, of promise. In other words, Perez's decolonial imaginary is itself a speculative space. The title of my keynote, Latinx Speculative Fiction and the Decolonial Imaginary, signals this connection. Although, to be sure, futurity is the privileged signifier in concepts such as Chicana futurism and, for that matter, alternative futurism, there is, as I see it, no doubt that Latinx speculative fiction is always already engaging in historical recovery and present day critique. I want to pause and acknowledge Curtis Meadows, who's not here. He'll be here later. And I base my understanding of the difference between futurism and futurity on his book that looks at farm worker futurisms, and he distinguishes between the two by noting that futurism is more of a static aesthetic, and futurity is this dynamic, perpetually evolving space that's not yet finished. For a utopia to be meaningful, it must also be critical. What I mean by this is simple. When writers turn to science fiction to depict utopian societies where, for example, racism no longer exists, or where gender and sexual oppression are a thing of the past, or where the ravages of late capitalism have finally been defeated, there is, I believe, an obligation to offer a roadmap of sorts. That is, to help us understand not only what these futures can look like, but to understand how they can become possible. And I will pause again and say that's why I'm so in awe of Walida Imarisha's work, because she matches the sort of speculative fiction that she's promoting with real life action by going into high schools and helping students learn how to write science fiction, build worlds, and then translate that into organizing. I proffer what I believe to be a fitting example of this type of work that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, namely the indigenous insurgency movement known colloquially as the Zapatista uprisings that emerged in the 1990s, which is the same decade, I argue, when Chicana cyberpunk emerged, and in which Perez first introduced the decolonial imaginary. In the transcripts of the addresses delivered during their first intercontinental encounter for humanity against neoliberalism, which thousands of people from around the world attended, the Zapatistas not only voiced their grievances against the ravages of neoliberalism, they also articulated a program for change, a blueprint of sorts for the decolonial imaginary to come into being. Make this go up, but I think you can see it. But this is an article looking back at the conference, and it says Zapatista Intergalactica. As an aside, I can't help but note here that this hemispheric event was dubbed with a decidedly sci-fi nickname, the Zapatista Intergalactica Gathering. As one journalist put it, the gathering was nicknamed the Intergalactica because in his convocation address, the rebels' spokesperson, the mysterious Subcomandante Marcos, invited all sentient life forms from other planets in the galaxy to participate in this event. Like Perez's decolonial imaginary, the Zapatista program is both backward-reaching and forward-looking. As stated in some of the opening remarks, it strives for, quote, a tomorrow that is harvested in the past. Like Perez's decolonial imaginary, it is discursive in formation and articulation. As one of the attendees put it, the larger Zapatista campaign has not been one of violent outbreaks, but rather a huge, brilliantly planned and creatively executed outbreak of communication. That is, the Zapatista approach is revolutionary because of its emphasis on communication and dialogue over authority and force. In fact, we see this sentiment in the language of the event's many public addresses and statements, where spokespersons for the event imagine what they call, quote, an intercontinental network of alternative communication. What's more, the tone of the event was marked by the speculative and the imaginative, a sense of futurity as opposed to finality. And here I'll read at length one of the addresses. This intercontinental network of alternative communications will search to weave channels so that words may travel all the paths that resist. This intercontinental network of alternative communication will be the medium by which distinct resistances communicate with one another. It is not an organizing structure, nor does it have a central head or decision maker, nor does it have a central command or hierarchy. We are the network, all of us who speak and listen. In closing, I guess I would humbly propose that this is what Latinx Visions represents as well. We have come here to pay homage to the promise of what happens when the political exigencies of the present and the collective memories of the past intersect with the potent possibilities of the imaginary. We're all time travelers looking backward, forward, and in front of us today. We have gathered here to acknowledge, appreciate, and explore the multifaceted world that is the Latinx speculative imaginary. But clearly, we are also here today to bring the speculative into the real. And here I'll close the loop and return to Anzaldua's charge, where we are bringing the real world of all those images. We are bringing into the real world all those images in our head. And we are doing this through the power of the pen, the paint, the performance, and the camera, with the recognition that the imaginary is a generative space and not an escapist fantasy. For Anzaldua has famously insisted that it is not enough to just react. First and foremost, we must act, create, and build, and do this together. Thank you. Do I go down?
So, I don't know what that microphone is, but at this point, we don't have any questions.
Okay, sure.
Anybody know where the microphone?
I think I could probably hear people yell. Oh, for the Zoom, right. Yes, I can repeat the question too. Yes.
Give an example at the end of your talk. Into practice in concrete action, taking the possibility and bringing this into that, not only to medical, but and the other example is the community has very much instead of this literary movement that really want to come by the maybe
what immediately comes to my mind is I don't know if you've heard of the film Machiavellis. It's a film that was I think it came out in the sometime like between 2006 and 2008, and it was a sort of this co-production that came about through the work of U.S. activists north of the border, and then labor activists, some of whom worked in the maquiladoras south of the border. And the activists were able to provide some resources like cameras, and well, I think basically cameras. And they gave the labor activists and the factory workers they invited them to film what was happening in the maquiladoras as best as they could, and to tell their own stories about what they were experiencing. And then through that collaboration, this film was made. And the film, it's not science fiction at all. But if you look at it, it has I would call it kind of sci-fi aesthetic, where the promotoras are basically talking about the experience of mechanized labor, and the sort of dehumanization that entails from that type of labor. And so through that effort, through that providing the technology to film their stories and to film the conditions of labor, there were small victories amongst the activists south of the border. They got a settlement from one of the corporations to address some of the health issues that they were experiencing. And so that's another example, I think, where you have the power of communications and alternative network of communications to, however minutely and temporarily, affect a kind of shift. So that doesn't speak, that wasn't a literary enterprise. It was by no means, and it was also not a US-based enterprise, but it was an example of these sort of underground illicit communication networks that happened across the border, that brought to the surface some of the conditions that were happening in the maquiladoras. And I've taught that film to my students in the past, and I've asked them to read it as a Chicana futurist text. So it's not a Chicana futurist, it's not fiction, it's nonfiction. And because there's such an emphasis on the use of technology and storytelling, the film can be read through that lens. So in that instance, you're taking Ramirez's, sort of very aesthetic, artistic concept, and you're taking it out of the context of the artistic and the imaginative, right, and higher ed, and you're using it to understand and appreciate that intersection between technology, in this case, the camera and the internet, and storytelling, but you're privileging and you're centering the stories of the maquiladora workers, and not, in fact, you don't ever meet any US activist in the film. They're not interviewed, they're not telling the story. It's clear that they're part of the story because they're providing these cameras and they're providing essentially the funds to make this film. But the center and the centered voices in that film are the laborers and the activists from the maquiladoras. So that would be an example to me of a way you could take something like Chicana futurism, or visionary fiction, which Imarisha is engaging in, and decontextualize it out of this very metaphoric realm and put it into the realm of the action and the real. So I'm also just, I'm going to get very academic here, but your question also reminds me of Eve Tuck's work, right? That decolonization, colonization is not a metaphor, that for these narratives to have any meaning, they have to be grounded in some kind of truth. So thank you for that. Other questions? Yes.
So I think I found that there's some pushback with a lot of these science fiction texts as nonfiction. And I really liked what you said in your talk that aligns between science fiction and social relations and possible. I'm wondering if you talk about that a little bit more. I mean, I have a great example like that, but so maybe not part of an example, but like just how to think about this pushback, I guess, when we're challenged or when we're not.
I didn't catch the last part, when we're challenged.
To be purely non-fiction. I'm sorry, purely a fiction.
Oh, I'm not familiar with the pushback. I borrowed that phrase from something like Ramirez. My entry into Chicana futurism came about through Afrofuturism, which is Black speculative fiction. And I hesitate to use the word Afrofuturism because it was coined by someone who's not of the African diaspora, and it elides the fact that a lot of African diasporic speculative fiction was already happening way before that term ever made it to print. So I'm not quite sure. The pushback being to read it just as fiction, or to.
So the desire to, what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And there's pushback that we should be only reading it as fiction for fiction's sake, instead of acknowledging that words are actually representing real beings, the social illusion.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that anytime, I think that anytime if you just read science fiction as not being extrapolations from the real world, you're missing a lot of the point of that piece. And I think this would apply to a lot of science fiction and fantasy for that matter. So I think what you're missing when you do that is you're missing what is likely happening, what likely the author is hoping for us to see, which is a defamiliarized version of the here and the now. And that's where, I mean, growing up reading science fiction, that was the joy, was to be able to sort of map the codes of the text in the real world for me. So I think if you only read science fiction as this sort of phantasmagoric enterprise that's, you know, a chance to escape the here and the now, you're missing out in the fun of figuring out, oh, wait, this is a defamiliarized version of this thing that's already happening. And for particular writers for whom the here and the now is not seen by the cultural dominant as real, right? But they don't believe that you experience that interaction with a policeman the way you did, or with a teacher the way you did. The speculative allows for you to do that, to sort of say, okay, well, this is what it feels like to experience this. And that defamiliarizing those experiences, I think, can be pleasurable, but also can be productive, as long as, like I said in my speech, we go from, okay, this is the imaginative space, this is maybe what we're trying to avoid, or this is maybe where we hope to be. But for any utopia or dystopia to have merit, I think it has to provide a blueprint. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Chela Sandoval's methodology of the oppressed. And it's like, well, why is so much of that text written in these decidedly speculative tropes? What's going on there? Why does she want to use these figures? And I think it's because she's developing a new language for new forms of, well, theorizing, but also organizing that didn't yet exist for her. That would be my reason for that. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, I think it's almost like a feedback with Ryan said, and what you were talking about with, is it Marisha Wall?
Walida y Marisha.
Okay, it's Octavia's group, right?
Yes.
And they talk about these as emergent strategies, right? And that's the term that I remember, right?
Yeah.
Like what you're talking about with the woman in my blog was the strategy of putting the film, putting the camera in the hands of these women so that they are kind of working through their own kind of performative testimonial.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think, you know, when you talk about the pushback, right, is, well, these are like, they're emergent strategies, right? They're these fictional works that want an action, right? They're almost like these action items or items that are kind of pushing us for different forms of production.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I think it's really interesting that you're bringing up, again, this kind of Afrofuturist or African futurism. I think that's
The way around that.
Yeah, I think it's a later term.
Mhm.
It's more likely used, but there are so many connections and
Mhm.
because some of these works. For a little, for longer, looking to works like this, to find these connections. What's happening with Latinx and Chicano. In itself, can be really productive.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Well, I have a question, but just kind of piggyback on what you're saying, and especially talking about. Sure, yeah, I just love the example of Machiavellis because it comes right before cell phones become really popular and ubiquitous. So that documentary style of actually giving cameras to these women was very like historically specific and only worked in that moment because that was right before cell phone. But you localize in New Mexico and your discussion of her readings of art, but I don't know if you intentionally did this, but you did it so beautifully. I think you really localized Los Angeles in your description of your formation. And I think that locality is so important for us to understand those details of our localities and how we understand our own alienation. That formation. So first of all, thank you for sharing that with us. And you're by looking at Ortiz, I was really struck by that imagery. And I'm so glad you looked at his work, and what really hit home literally for me was the use of the toys in front of the mural. And the mural was that taken in Los Angeles because Ortiz is LA based. Yeah, he was born in Mexico, and then he did all of his credentials were in the United States and Los Angeles. Yes. And so credit to your formation, and why I say it hits home is because my brother had those toys. And they predated Transformers, right? They're Shogun warriors. They're based on Japanese anime, but then like licensed in the 70s. And I think the 70s is kind of this decade that I haven't really thought of too much. And so I think that there's like, it's an interesting image to use to think about childhood, right? And voice and representation in the 70s and being localized, right? Yeah. And how that informs our understanding of robots, of alienation, and also like separate alienation. So I don't know if I have a question there, but I really love that you use that image, and there's so much there. Thank you. Yeah, and I honestly, I was inspired to think of Los Angeles initially, not because of Ortiz, although that happened as I was working, but Viramontes' novel, Their Dogs Came With Them, because that novel, and I know there's a paper in this conference that's going to look at that novel screams to me to be read through a kind of speculative lens. Just in terms of form, Viramontes is, she's always playing with perspective and voice and time in a way that sort of disrupts like a linear way of thinking about time and memory. And the thick descriptions of the bulldozers that create the freeways that displace entire neighborhoods are very sci-fi to me. And I haven't done it yet. I haven't taught it in a while, but again, being who I am, I will often ask my students, can we use Chicano futurism and other sort of theoretical pieces that are in Chicano futurism or other sorts of alternative futurisms as tools to analyze what Sam Delaney would call a mundane text. It's not commercialized or promoted as science fiction, but how can we tease out the speculative, and how does teasing that out enable us to see something else that Viramontes is trying to do? And then in doing that, I uncovered this fascinating history of the LA system in Los Angeles, and how, on the one hand, it's a real obvious reading to say, oh, it cut through East LA so that Angelenos would never have to see these neighborhoods. They never have to think about them on their way to work from A to B, because the freeways, you don't go through these neighborhoods, so they remain invisible. But I also learned that during the push to build these freeways, there was a
a regular Sunday program on one of the local radio stations that was about basically arguing on a weekly basis that the system was the freeway system was God's work, it was God's will. So they have this really weird sort of the emergence of the freeway system is tied to this like proselytizing white Christian dogmatic narrative that was circulating on the airwaves, local airwaves in Los Angeles. So the built environment is never politically neutral. And also because listening to my father's family talk about what Los Angeles was like before the freeways is just fascinating to me. Just how it just seemed like a completely different world because it was. And so he was, growing up before the freeways, he sort of saw firsthand not only the impacts that they had on, on the city, but also how it changed his own racial position in the city. And he lived in a part of the city where, again, like I said, once the freeways arrived, people never had to see, never had to think about. And then when I was born into a slightly higher class, that world was as foreign to me, right, as the white neighborhoods were to him. So it's just interesting to think about. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate this.